Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Welcome to our briefing. Next stop, Sustainable Public Transit and Mobility. I'm Dan Brissett. I'm the president of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute, and I'd like to start by saying thanks to Senator Welch for his help with the room today. Thanks to everyone in our in-person audience and in our online audience. Very briefly, EESI was founded by a bipartisan group of members of Congress, and since 1984, we have worked to provide information about environmental, clean energy, and climate change topics to policymakers and the public. That looks like this, lots and lots and lots of briefings. This is one of several briefings that we're doing about transportation in the context of the upcoming surface transportation reauthorization. But we do briefings on other topics. We did briefings on climate modeling, on the budget and appropriations process, on sort of a snapshot of the sustainable energy sector in the United States. And everything we do, whether it's a briefing or an article or a podcast or a fact sheet, everything's available at eesi.org. If you visit us online, you can subscribe to our biweekly newsletter, Climate Change Solutions. We actually just had an issue go out a little bit earlier today, so if you sign up and you haven't signed up for that one, you'll get one in 2 weeks. And if you want us to forward you, we would be happy to forward you. We don't want anyone to miss out on all the cool stuff that we're doing. What we try really hard to do is we put ourselves in the positions of a congressional staff person and say, how could we make our resources timely, relevant, accessible, and practical? We put a lot of thought into making sure that our resources are there before congressional staff even know they need the information. And to that end, we actually just launched a brand new resource that we call Rapid Readouts. These are semi-regular, 30-ish minute briefings, mini briefings, online only, to really focus on something that's in the news. And so on Friday, we did one of these on Energy Star and all of the benefits that accrue to society from having Energy Star. And we were joined by Ben Evans with the U.S. Green Building Council and Aaron Hyatt with Retail Industry Leaders Association, and talked all about what Energy Star is, how it works, and why it is in the public's interest as well as the interest of manufacturers and retailers and building developers and everybody, pretty much everybody. I think in my intro I said if you've used energy in the last 35 years, you've benefited from Energy Star, and that's not really much of an exaggeration. Again, these are going to come up really fast, and so subscribing to Climate Change Solutions and following us on social media at EESI Online on our Blue Sky or Instagram, it's the best way to make sure you never miss anything. But today, we are all about public transportation, and in my mind, public transportation is a luxury. The fact that on an average day I can get from where I live in Prince George's County to the EESI's office for $4 in 26 minutes, that is incredible. I'm incredibly lucky to have that. And I can do so while I'm actually working, which don't always want to do, but no excuse if you're on Metro. Or I can be catching up on the Comedy Bang Bang or whatever podcast I happen to be listening at that time. And it's so much better because instead I'm not, inventing new permutations of profanity because someone doesn't know what a green arrow is or how it works, or I'm not running the risk of getting rear-ended in traffic. It's just an all-around better experience. You can sign me up a million times over. Anyway, I know there's a lot of privilege wrapped up in what I just said, and I wish everybody had all the options for public transit that I have and that many people who live in this part of the country have. Did you know that more than 4 million people ride the subway in New York every day? And that's compared to about 2.9 million people who fly commercial in the United States. So that many more people ride the subway in just that one city compared to all of the air traffic that happens on an average day in the United States. And about 6,800 public transit providers across the U.S. carry millions and millions of people in rural and urban communities to work, school, medical appointments, and grocery stores by bus, ferry, tram, subway, what have you. Investing in expanded and accessible public transportation systems not only makes it possible for people to travel safely and affordably, but it also reduces local air pollution and improves land use, and it supports millions and millions of jobs. Like a lot of what we cover in EESI briefings, this boils down to policy choices. Do we want a transportation system that makes it faster, easier, and cheaper to get around? Or would we rather make one that's harder, slower, and more expensive? And that, of course, includes the costs of air and water pollution. These are some of the other briefings we've got coming up. We'll be back next Wednesday for one about federal rail policy, very, very humorously titled, Choose to Learn About Federal Rail Policy. And then we'll be doing one on highways in June. And then we have some other great briefings coming up about extreme heat and the Congressional Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Expo and Policy Forum. We'll put this up again at the end of the briefing. Sorry, I thought you were doing something else. If you have a moment to take our survey, we read every response. We'd really appreciate if you have any feedback you'd like to share with us. It only takes 2 minutes or so. We have two tremendous speakers today. We had a third speaker. Unfortunately, he called in sick. However, his slides are still posted online, and they're also included in the printouts that you picked up when you entered the room. But we have two tremendous speakers today, and after we hear their presentations, we are going to have some questions. We'll be able to take questions in the room for sure. We'll also take questions from our online audience. And if you have a question online, you can send us an email. The email address to use is ask, that's ask@eesi.org. And we'll be doing real-time coverage on Blue Sky and our Instagram story. First up today, we have Rebecca Higgins. Rebecca is the Vice President of Policy at the Eno Center for Transportation, a nonprofit charitable foundation that provides government and industry leaders with timely research and an independent voice on transportation policy issues. Prior to this role, Rebecca served in the Biden-Harris administration as the Chief of Staff for the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council. She was a senior policy advisor for the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. I'm also an EPW alum, where she led the highway reauthorization work for the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. She began her work in transportation as a presidential management fellow at the U.S. Department of Transportation's Office of Policy and as a transportation policy intern at the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. So you've made it. You've gone from intern to panelist, and that is tremendous. So Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. I'll invite you up to the lectern, and you can bring your name tent if you'd like, and we'll take it away. You can take it away. And here's
great. Thank you. Is that... Hi. Is this volume okay? No one's getting blasted? Great. Nice to meet you all. All right, let me advance. Nope, not that. They assured me this was easy. Oh, there it goes. So I'm just going to start with kind of a broad overview, lay of the land on public transportation and climate. You probably all already know, but the transportation sector, a little less than a third of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Globally, it's lower than that because globally more people rely on public transit than they do in the U.S. In the U.S., obviously, you see the enormous, more than half of the pie is the light-duty vehicles. Public transportation doesn't even have its own slice of the pie, you might notice. So rail includes freight rail, passenger rail, intercity, and heavy-duty within a city rail. Buses are part of the all other transportation sources. That includes buses, which are transit buses, as well as over-the-road buses, your Greyhound buses, school buses, etc. It also includes pipelines, it includes motorcycles, and it includes lubricants. So all of those equates to 6% of our U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, and then the rail 2%. But like I said, public transit is just a small piece within that very small slice of pie. So when we think about reducing energy emissions from the transportation sector, there's sort of two sides that we can use to reduce emissions. The one side is energy efficiency. How do we reduce emissions from the conveyance of people and good? So improving engine efficiency, transitioning from ICE vehicles to electric vehicles. So for public transit, obviously, there's not that many emissions already. So really, the demand side solution is much more important. My former boss, Tom Carper, loved this quote. There was a bank robber long before any of us were born, whose name was Willie Sutton. And he was asked, why do you rob banks? And he would say, because that's where the money is. And when it comes to emissions, light-duty vehicles are where the money is. That's where we need to reduce emissions. But public transportation plays an enormous role in providing an option for people to choose transit rather than driving in a single occupancy vehicle. As Dan said, it's a luxury to ride transit. Unfortunately, in this country, it shouldn't have to be a luxury. Every person should have access to that choice if they wanted it. And right now, there are many people who don't really have access to high quality, reliable transit service. So, advance. So another thing to think about, though, not just is where it's the opportunity for reducing emissions, but how do we use federal policy to reduce emissions? So there's sort of the funding, the carrots side of the equation, and then there's the regulatory, pricing, et cetera, sticks side of the equation. And when it comes to transit, again, we can do both. On the funding side, obviously, for transportation generally, we have tax credits for purchasing electric vehicles, or for fleets of vehicles like our zero emission buses that public transit agencies can purchase. We have charging infrastructure that we can provide funding and tax credits and do until they're repealed. We also have infrastructure funding programs on the public transportation side that help to expand our infrastructure networks. We have transit benefits and other kinds of incentives to encourage people to use transit or other low emission modes. And then we have sticks. We have emission standards and attempts to or other regulations that would get rid of high emitting engines and other sources of emissions. And then we have pricing, such as congestion pricing. And some of those are kind of paired with funding, where you have, like in New York, you have congestion pricing to increase the cost of using a private vehicle, while also dedicating that funding to transit to increase the availability and reliability of the transit service. So that's sort of the lay of the land for how we approach policy with regard to emissions and transit specifically. But why is transit such an important solution for emissions? So the reason, there's sort of a couple of parts of it, that the emissions efficiency of moving a large number of people on a bus is just much, much more efficient compared to that vehicle moving one person or even 2 or 3 people. You have a much lower per person emissions, even if you have a diesel bus. A diesel bus is still a much, much more efficient way of moving people than everyone driving in their single occupancy ICE vehicle. And I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind as we think about transportation emission solutions, is that we don't have to rely on converting transit buses to electric. That's a hugely important thing to do. But in my opinion, a large part of that benefit is because diesel emissions create particulate matter hotspots in dense communities where then you have the asthma impacts and other air quality impacts that are not just climate change related, but diesel engines still provide a tremendous efficiency improvement compared to single occupancy vehicles. The other piece, obviously, we can use zero emission buses to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Really tremendous benefits compared to diesel and CNG. And then finally, I think a piece is the land use kind of co-benefits. When you create a new station, you're able to have a higher level of density of housing and jobs and schools, et cetera, able to access that. You don't need to have as many lanes of road or as much parking. You can have a denser land use that's supported by the transit, even while the denser land use is supportive of the transit ridership. So it's sort of a beneficial cycle. And then we kind of think about, so that's like the why on transit, and then the how have we advanced transit sustainability. So again, the demand side intervention, we can shift people away from traveling by single occupancy vehicle onto transit. For that efficiency, we use federal grants and loans through the Federal Transit Administration to reduce, to expand transit networks. And because public transit is, they're public agencies, they largely rely on federal funding. It's fairly easy to encourage them to convert to electric buses in a way that it's a little bit more difficult for privately owned vehicles, to convert. We had a cash for clunkers system and we have tax credits, in the past, but it's the public ownership of transit systems makes it simpler to either attach strings to it or have funding that's dedicated to zero emission. So, as Dan mentioned, I spent a long time on the Hill. I was on the EPW committee, just to give kind of a brief overview of how our policymaking process works with regards to public transit. In the House, things are much simpler. The Transportation and Infrastructure Committee has jurisdiction for all of the authorization for all transportation modes. In the Senate, it's much more complicated, but the Banking Committee has the jurisdiction for transit. And then the Commerce Committee has rail aviation and safety. And then the Environment and Public Works Committee has the highways jurisdiction. And of course, the Finance and Ways and Means Committee have the jurisdiction for the revenues that we use to pay for these programs. We're currently operating under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It was passed about 4 years ago. It expires September of next year. And that bill was it was a really interesting and unusual reauthorization. It included $660.8 billion, which was much larger than past bills. And part of the reason was because it included funding for rail that was not previously advance appropriated. So let me talk a little bit about the funding. We have three forms, basically, of funding for transportation. One form is the Highway Trust Fund dollars. We have money that comes in through the gas tax, certain other taxes, and it gets deposited into the Highway Trust Fund. We then use that money to pay for highways and transit, and that's called contract authority. We have money that's subject to appropriations. That may not happen ever, but authorizers write it. In the IIJA, for the first time ever, we had advance appropriation. We had 5 years of funding for a variety of programs. And then one thing to note, we have a shortfall in our highway trust fund. So that's, we have a transit account that runs roughly an $11 billion a year shortfall, and a highway account that runs roughly a $30 billion a year shortfall. So when we're reauthorizing, it'll be roughly $100 billion that we need to find for highways and little less than $50 billion that we need to find for transit. And that matters because in the current budget reconciliation bill, they have proposed an EV fee of $250 for electric vehicles, and that will only go to the highway account. So there's been no funding for new transit that's been created in that reconciliation bill. Another really important thing to realize, all of these modes had advance appropriations in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, but the amount of reliance on advance appropriations was much higher. In the rail, obviously, it's 100% of all of the funding that they got was advance appropriation. Transit, it was almost a quarter of their funding was the advance appropriation. And then highways, it was just 13%. So when we look at reauthorizing those programs, it's not at all clear that people are talking about reauthorizing the advance appropriations programs. That will result in a very significant reduction in funding for the transit programs relative to the highway programs. And as you can see, the green amounts, it's already a very significant disparity in the amount of funding that we provide to transit versus highways. So just FYI, these are the programs that we did include in the advance appropriation. So if you're looking at what is most vulnerable to be extended, these are they. And that is the end of my slides. Thanks. Yeah.
Your EESI intern training prepared you well.
I learned it all.
The role on a briefing. I just wanted to mention we've done we're doing a lot of and have done some transportation briefings. So I definitely encourage everyone to check out the 4th installment of our Congressional Climate Camp series, which was sort of a process and path forward look at surface transportation reauthorization. A lot of the things that you were talking about in the broader context was mentioned there. Also, if you have questions, and questions are starting to come in, so thank you for that in our online audience. If anyone has any questions, the best way to get them to us is to send us an email. The email address to use is ask@eesi.org. And of course, for folks in the room, we'll have a roving microphone. So I mentioned that one of our presenters is not with us today. That is Jonah Crespo. Jonah's slides, however, they're right here. They're really nice. Jonah, we hope you're feeling better. And maybe even watching us on the live cast. Jonah's slides are in the printed handouts at the beginning of the thing, or that were on the table when you walked in. We are going to call an audible, And when we get to, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who has a little bit of history on the manufacturer side as well. So Jarrett Stoltzfus is going to talk a little bit with us about sort of what it looks like from a manufacturing perspective. And then he's going to get his regular time to talk about his slides. But let me give him a proper introduction. Jarrett is the Director of Infrastructure and Transportation at Arnold Ventures, and that work involves advancing scalable solutions for more efficient and effective transportation systems. Before joining Arnold Ventures, he worked for over 15 years in the transportation sector, including at Terawatt Infrastructure, commercial charging infrastructure provider, Proterra, an electric vehicle and battery manufacturer, and Foothill Transit, a public transportation agency in Los Angeles County. Jarrett has also held various roles at the Federal Transit Administration, but he's not a former EESI intern, but we let him on the panel anyway. Jarrett, welcome to the briefing. I'll invite you up to the lectern and you can bring your name tent. And Rebecca was able to get hers to stay, so I have a lot of faith in you.
Do my best here.
Thank you.
So thanks, folks, for having me here. I'll just going to riff a little bit first on the bus manufacturing side since Jonah can't make it. So apologies, I don't have any slides, but I can talk through pretty quick. So Jonah had originally was gonna talk about the roles of buses and public transit in the bus manufacturing sector. So as was mentioned earlier. Some of the largest cities in the U.S. run a ton of people on rail. New York City it alone carries more people than the next 5 or 6 rail transit systems in the U.S. But buses are really the workhorse of public transportation in the U.S. Pretty much, almost every single transit agency in the U.S. Runs some sort of bus. Anything from a small cutaway, if you've ever been to like a airport or hotel shuttle, those are like the little ones. With kind of like a little truck front to the regular full-size buses you see around DC, for example, that you might get on Metro. So of the several hundred transit systems, big transit systems in the US, and there's many smaller rural ones, everyone runs buses, and they are really critical in the US. Transit bus manufacturing in the US is a important industry. It's actually not a very big one. In the U.S., we have about 60,000 transit buses total. If you compare that to the school bus fleet, which is about 500,000, and the truck fleet, which is medium heavy duty truck fleet, which Rebecca referenced earlier, is about 12 million. And then 2 to 3 million of that is around Class 8 trucks, the big tractor trailers you see on the road. So although they're a small portion of the U.S. of sort of the medium heavy duty vehicle fleet, they're moving a ton of people, several billion a year. In DC, several 100,000 per day, just on the bus alone. So, in the U.S., we have a kind of very specific bus market. Most, as Rebecca had mentioned, most transit funding comes from the U.S. Most transit funding from the federal government comes from the U.S. Department of Transportation, something called the Federal Transit Administration, which is pretty much funds most of the buses you see in the U.S. There's also for every transit agency, there's state funds. I'll talk a little bit about this later in my piece. Local funds may come from like sales tax or something, and then money you might generate the fare box when you pay your fare with your coins or bills or card. So buses are manufactured there's a specific set of U.S. Federal requirements by America. So for this program and other programs, actually both parties have kind of coalesced around this policy about domestic manufacturing. So for a bus, for example, 70%, the bus has to be made in the U.S., so the assembly of the vehicle, and then 70% of the parts, of the cost of the parts of components and subcomponents have to be made in the U.S. as well. So that's been a policy decision we've made at USDOT is implementing, Congress has made to support U.S. manufacturing and U.S. manufacturing jobs. There's some other requirements around this space I think you'd ask me to speak to. The bus has to run for at least 12 years if it's a big bus, like the kind you see you get on at Metro outside the Capitol. Smaller ones might be 4 to 7 years, depending on the size, but it's a pretty unique set of requirements, especially domestic content piece. But a lot of these pieces are in place here to support national policy goals. like domestic manufacturing or durability. Taxpayer funds, of course, are going into a vehicle. You want the vehicle to operate a certain amount of time. Um, in terms of electrifying bus systems, that's something, or just the transition in different fuel types. As Rebecca mentioned, I just do want to highlight that any bus that's carrying a number of people is doing good for air quality, is doing good for emissions, because it is inherently moving way more people with less energy than you might typically have, and that's true for the most emitting vehicle, which is typically a diesel bus, anywhere from CNG, compressed natural gas, excuse me, compressed natural gas, hybrid electric buses, or some of the zero emission fuel types, hydrogen fuel cell, or battery electric. So there's been a big move in the space. Historically, many buses for 70, 80 years were diesel. Starting in the early 2000s, there was a move to compressed natural gas, particularly in California, with some of the regulatory environment there. And over time, because of federal funding programs and other regulations and funding sources, some at the state level too, we've seen a transition to zero emission, both on the battery electric side and also on the hydrogen fuel cell side. So, I think looking forward in terms of bus manufacturing and the future of the bus in the US, I mean, the bus continues to be really central in the US for moving folks. As we look about how to finance and fund projects, you may have heard of rail transit. There's a bus rapid transit, which is mimicking a lot of the forms of rail transit with high capacity buses, dedicated stations, dedicated right away. As funding dynamics ebb and flow, it's often the choice in many metro areas to say, hey, let's look at the options in front of us, look at our projected ridership, and look at the ways we could potentially move folks. And buses, again, both in low ridership, critical social service transportation, but also in high ridership situations, one of the best choices. So, apologies, I riffed a little bit because I was just filling in for Jonah there. So, I can probably pivot to my presentation now. So, as you mentioned, been in transportation over 15 years, federal, local, manufacturing, and now philanthropy. So, just make sure I have this right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of philanthropy, and then also the universe of transit stakeholders. As you met. Oh,
No.
okay, good. Okay, sorry. The role of philanthropy, and then also just kind of the interplay of transit and its various stakeholders. As mentioned, I served on the executive team of the transit agency in Los Angeles. Very dense, very active region with a lot of car drivers. If you've ever been to Los Angeles, also a lot of public transit is really critical in that region. LA Metro and several of the other big transit agencies like Foothill, where I worked for, were moving millions of folks a day. People don't often think of Los Angeles or cities outside the Northeast as big transit cities, but they often are. Transit's really critical for communities. So I want to just talk a little bit about Arnold Ventures. We're a philanthropy. Core missions invest in evidence-based solutions that maximize opportunity, minimize injustice. We have a fairly new infrastructure program aiming to bolster the country's ability to build basically infrastructure projects faster, better, and lower cost, supporting policymakers and crafting implementing solutions, looking at ways to remove barriers that slow down project delivery, sometimes raise cost, and working to build state capacity. How can we enhance the ability of government to deliver those investments? So public transportation, is really a partnership between a whole bunch of different entities. When I served, the first time I went from federal to local, kind of really viscerally felt the interplay with all the different organizations that you work with as a transit agency. You're often you're a local government agency. You're working with other local governments, cities, regional planning associations, other organizations. You're working with your state, who's often may regulate you as in almost every single state as a funder. and the federal government, who plays a regulatory role and is also a significant funder. You're working with local businesses who are served and whose employees take your service. You're working with community organizations who rely on your service to bring folks to and from events and workplaces and community needs. You're working with different riders, the folks that get on daily and rely on your service, residents, because your service goes through neighborhoods and blocks and cities, advocates that, and may care, as we've discussed earlier, about air quality or mobility or housing. You're working with real estate, especially if you're building high capacity frequent transit. You're not only building transit, you're working with cities and development interests on how you maximize that public investment you're making to have the best public outcomes. And then, of course, manufacturers and service providers as well. We're the challenges and opportunities for public transportation. We're, candidly in this moment, and we're in a reauthorization discussion. Funding environment's uncertain. Post-COVID, there's been some fundamental changes to the way ridership patterns post-COVID. And then, there's been a continuing advances in the transportation sector around technology. But there's, I think, a lot of opportunities as well. Opportunities to think about project delivery and streamlining, maximizing the investment we've made around transit, not just in this year or past years, but over the last several decades, and thinking about how to adopt new technologies in practice. So Rebecca had covered this already, but the Surface Transportation Bill, again, up in 26 or beyond, unclear funding environment. Some states are all in on transit. California, New York, others have less of a commitment. Some states put no money in, and a lot of states are kind of in the middle. In good years, they may have dedicated programs, they may have competitive programs, they may or they may not choose to invest at all. And we see that kind of fluctuate from year to year. With some of the federal uncertainty and sometimes local uncertainty, that creates a really uncertain environment for folks that may rely on transit from a day-to-day perspective. At the local level, some regions have put together transit. Los Angeles, where I was, had just, while I was there, passed a 0.5-cent sales tax to fund a several decade-long program of capital projects to just build out an amazing number of rail and bus rapid transit and other systems. Other regions, Dallas is having a moment where they're examining whether to continue. Cities will continue to pay into the regional sales tax. So this, some regions are creating more opportunities to fund transit locally. Some cities, some regions may be stepping back, even in this moment. And then farebox. That's when you get on transit. Transit is a social service, and I want to clarify this. When you get on your transit bus or transit rail vehicle, your fare typically does not pay for the whole cost. It pays for a portion. So you make up the difference often with other state, federal, and local funding sources and sometimes other opportunities. But because of the changes to operating environments, ridership patterns, we're in a different local funding environment than we once were. And just going back to ridership changes, pandemics really impacted ridership across transit agencies. Some systems are over pre-pandemic ridership. They're doing really well. Many systems are significantly below pre-pandemic highs. BART in the Bay Area, for example, is at something like 30% of what the ridership once was. So there's a big funding gap. Other systems are doing, have come back just kind of based on their ridership patterns and so forth. Continuing technological advancement. Transit's one of several non-car transportation modes. In the past couple of years, we've seen advancement of competing and complementary modes where transit operates, micromobility, transportation, ride-sharing, transportation network companies. And so some folks, those forms of mobility have kind of eaten into or competing with transit's interest. And we're also seeing, right now it's primarily in the single occupancy vehicle space, but AV vehicles start to really take off in some regions. In Los Angeles and San Francisco and others, Phoenix, you see autonomous, at least rideshare, both permitted and also some becoming a mobility mode of choice. So from a philanthropic perspective, we're looking at I think there's a number of different opportunities just in this funding moment we're in, thinking about project delivery, in a constrained funder environment, how can we deliver projects more quickly? Streamlining, how can we get funds both out more quickly from funding agencies and from those implementing them? How can we choose projects better? Some states, Virginia's nearby is a great example of this. They have a program called Smart Scale, which they have a very robust program to decide how they choose projects. Maximizing the investment in TOD, we've had decades of investment in transit capital, rail and bus, and there's an amazing opportunity to build more housing, which there's very much a lack of supply of in the US around these transit lines and transit investments. And then, as I mentioned earlier, technology adoption. So it's going back to the earlier point on philanthropy. So, we create dialogue through research, policy, data advocacy on thinking about supporting policymakers on how to, think about these issues, funding challenges, delivery challenges, implementation challenges, and how to implement them better. How to remove barriers, regulations, where there's opportunities to make those work, and improve the timelines and cost structure, and then what we can do to build state capacity, at agencies to help deliver projects more effectively. So, and I see I am at time. So thank you. That's it.
Here you go. Oh,
Sorry.
trade you. Okay, good. Thank you. Great. Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. And thanks again for filling in on the manufacturing side. I'm glad that we were able to feature buses because it is, like you said, it's the workhorse. I don't usually use the bus, but that's not because I don't like the bus. It's just that Metro happens to kind of just work for me. But we are going to have our Q&A. My friend Hannah has a microphone and a camera. She's double duty today. If you have a question in the room, please catch my eye and raise your hand, and Hannah will come over to you. It's important that we wait for the mic so that the live cast can do it. To get us started, Rebecca, I kind of would like to maybe come back to you. It's something that you had on one of your slides that I think might be a good way to kind of kick off the Q&A. And that is this idea of transportation policy, land use policy nexus. And actually, there. Now we're not being lit from the back. So I'd like to go into a little bit more detail there and what could be done at the federal level better to sort of close gaps between where transportation policy leaves off and where land use policy begins. And Jarrett, after Rebecca, I'd be very eager to hear your opinions too.
Sure. I'm happy to talk a bit about that. And I noticed that in Jonah's slides that we didn't get to hear from him, he had a lot about how transit is an economic development, a source of economic development. I have actually a variety of feelings about that. I think that it is true, absolutely true, that transit stations can really kick off important economic development. I think there's also sometimes an unfortunate tendency of using new transit to build in a place where there isn't currently demand, and sort of a build it and then let the land use follow, which I think can be detrimental and not the best use of transit dollars, which obviously are sorely limited. So I think that the key here is making sure that there's really good coordination between the transportation planning and the housing planning and economic development planning, all of which are federally required. We have required comprehensive economic development strategies, and we have required housing plans, and we have required federal transportation plans. I think that the making sure that those are coordinated, and we did take a step to improve that coordination in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Hello. So do you want to pause and
But Jarrett, glad your name isn't like Jessica.
Yes, thank you.
We will definitely come back to you, Jarrett, but we have a very special guest who just walked in, and I would like to give the mic over to her. Thank you so much for joining us. Representative LaMonica McIver represents New Jersey's 10th district. That happens to include Newark. 10th District is a vital regional and international transportation hub with a stretch of the Northeast Rail Corridor, Newark Liberty International Airport, Port of Newark, New Jersey Transit, and the PATH rail system. Representative McIver is focused on advancing a safe, efficient, and sustainable transportation system that serves everyone equitably. She's also a member of the House Small Business, Homeland Security Committees, and before serving in Congress, she was on Newark City Council for 6 years, including 3 as council president. Representative McIver, if you would like to make your way to the lectern, you'll have a better view of the audience. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And I'm Dan, by the way. Sorry.
Thank you. It's you were reading it out. I was like, God, I forgot I have all those areas. I'm counting it up. But thank you so much for allowing me to be here today. As mentioned, I'm Congresswoman LaMonica McIver, a little over 200 days now in Congress. Yes, I am counting. And feels like it's been 20 years, but it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. The role of federal transportation and infrastructure investments in strengthening our neighborhoods, creating economic opportunities, and addressing some of the most pressing challenges we face, like climate change. In New Jersey's 10th Congressional District, we've seen firsthand how smart infrastructure investments can really transform lives. Better transit options for commuters have made our city a global competitor. We see every day how driving jobs and economic growth start with access. This is something I've been talking about as the city council member and as the council president, and now here in Congress. How we can make our city hubs for innovation by making commuting more efficient and, of course, reliable. Investments on our transit systems and infrastructure are not just building roads. I say this all the time, and railroads. They are paving the way for a brighter, more connected future. Currently, we have a unique opportunity to take bold steps forward in how we think about infrastructure. For too long, transportation systems have been designed without considering the broader needs of our communities. As we know, transportation is more than just getting from point A to point B. It's about connecting people to jobs, education, healthcare, and opportunities. It's about ensuring that no community, no matter how rural or urban, is left behind. Federal investments in transportation can and should be a tool for building more resilient communities by focusing on projects that address not only current infrastructure needs, but also the challenges posed by climate change. We can create systems that stand the test of time. When we invest in modernizing our public transit, building safer roads, and improving pedestrian and bike infrastructure, I always stress that bike infrastructure, very important to me. I know I need to ride more. I like that one woo I got in the crowd though. We're not just making our streets safer, but we're creating jobs, improving health outcomes, and ensuring access to the economic opportunity for people who need it most. I've been a proud co-sponsor and champion of legislation that improves services and provides high quality and affordable transportation to those who society often forgets. I honestly came into this role as an elected official not knowing that I would do so much work around infrastructure. But many of you know who've been following the stories around Newark, New Jersey, we've had problems with water. We've had problems with making sure we get all of those pipes changed. And I never thought a day where we'd be able to do that on a city level without any federal support by bonding and doing it through a global pandemic. And we accomplished that. And so this is more work that we have to do at the federal level. It's one of the reasons that brought me here in the first place, to make sure that I stress that and echo that on this level in government. Because back then, when we were dealing with that situation in Newark around our water infrastructure, we needed all of the support that we can get, and especially from our federal level. And we didn't get that at that time. And that is why we had to bond, make local legislative changes, and do the things that we had to do. And I know that together, especially with some of you in this room, we can make sure that our transportation and infrastructure policies create a better, more resilient future for all Americans, because it's a just right to have good infrastructure and transportation to make sure that Americans have what they need. So thank you so much for the time, for allowing me to come chat with you today. Wish I had more time to stay with you all. Trust me, I'd rather be in here in this room today with you all than going back out there. I always say out there to where I'm going, but thank you so much.
thank you very much for joining us today. And it means a lot that you were able to stop by today. So good luck with everything. Thank you again. And thanks for all your assistance as well. We're going to pick up the Q&A kind of where we left off. So Jarrett, I'm going to pose the same question to you. What could be done at a higher level at the federal level to help close gaps where transportation policy and land use policy leave off?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think this is sometimes a bigger challenge than folks realize it is because transportation policy funding, it's coming from the federal and the state level. The land use decisions are made at the local level. And like the Congresswoman, I'm actually a former municipal elected as well. And the challenges, you have challenges sometimes in communities getting folks to get on board with denser housing, denser housing, denser development, housing, residential, commercial. You need it to make transit effective, and it's really critical to often have the commercial density you need to make a store work, and to make the economics pan out. So that's the thing I think is really important is making sure there's a good partnership there. If you're gonna request money for if you need resources for a large transit project, communities that it goes through need to really think hard about making the zoning changes, the residential, the commercial density changes to make that transit effective, and to make those developments successful. So I think to that end, in terms of federal policy or even state policy, when you're funding a major capital investment, prioritizing or possibly even requiring, a certain minimum level of density or of development to make that work, because you really need that. They each feed into each other.
Right. Well, I know we live coincidentally a few miles from each other, and it is amazing to see how land use changes around the metro stations and Rhode Island Avenue, Baltimore Avenue, those big corridors through Prince George's County. Like, it's not a coincidence that that's where businesses pop up, right? So I saw a question in the audience. So Hannah, right behind you, 2 rows. Thanks for being with us today, and happy to give you a chance to ask a question.
Hi, thank you. I'm Sophia. I am totally with you in terms of what you said about buses, and diesel buses are, still better than individual ICEs. But statistically, it says that you need 9.2 passengers in the bus to make it statistically more energy efficient than 9.2 drivers in a ICE vehicle. How do you talk to people who are like, oh, there's only going to be 2 passengers in this giant bus in the off peak, but I still believe that during high peak season, there's going to be like the bus is packed and things like that. How do you talk about these things and convince people to seriously consider bus transit systems?
Thanks. Rebecca, please feel free.
Well, I'm sure that Jarrett also has some thoughts on this, but I guess one thing that immediately comes to mind is, and I think that Dan sort of opened with the concept of the multiple benefits of public transportation systems. So one of those benefits clearly is sustainability and efficiency. But that's not the only benefit. There's also it is a service that is being provided to people in a community. And there are many people who may not have access to personal vehicles, or who are not able to drive and still need to be able to access their jobs and their healthcare and schools, et cetera. And so I think that there is some degree to which if a community has decided that they want to provide that transportation service to the members of their community, that that's a recognition of those multiple benefits, and it's not solely a climate change intervention. The other thing that I would just note, there's definitely, as Jarrett was saying, on land use, there are densities that are not transit supportive, and where it doesn't make sense to run, large buses. And in those communities, and in rural transit systems, I think that looking at alternatives, shuttles that are going to have a lower fuel usage, or other alternatives that are on-demand transit, et cetera, can be beneficial. They have different costs associated with them. They're different. We actually, has a report on rural transit coming out soon that kind of explores a variety of different models of transit for rural areas. And there are also rideshare companies that are partnering with transit agencies to provide on-demand service. So I think that there are ways that could be more energy efficient as well. But again, just reiterating, there are reasons to provide transit service that go beyond the climate benefits.
Thanks. Jarrett, if you have anything you'd like to add, please feel free.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, this is kind of going back to the importance of aligning land use with transportation investments. Sometimes we've made transportation investments where the land use isn't necessarily there yet. And part of building good transit and is also creating good land use policy around that transit. As Rebecca mentioned, I think, transit's really critical. Again, if folks live in this region, you see how critical transit is for moving people in and out of the core city. In a lot of parts of the country, it plays that role, but also plays a secondary role in terms of just critical mobility for many folks. There might be routes with low ridership often there, in a lot of parts of the country, in tribal lands and rural communities, that bus is a critical piece of mobility for folks that may not have any other options just because of income, because of disability, because of age, and a number of other factors. So I think, it's important to think about, we should run transit where it's needed. We should also think about the coverage where we need to provide it, even if sometimes ridership may be lower because of the critical mobility it may offer.
Great, thanks. Looking for other questions in the audience. If you have one, please feel free to raise your hand. I am more than locked and loaded for other questions. So if you're still working up your courage. Jarrett, maybe we'll stay with you. This is something that you talked a little bit about in your slides. And that is sort of research and data needs. And maybe this even gets at the question that was just asked too. What's the federal role in compiling data and research that state and local governments can use to inform their transit planning and transportation planning?
Yeah, so I think the federal government plays a significant role it collects a lot of data from transit agencies. So actually, if you're live in a city and you're ever curious about what your transit agency does, how much service it provides, where the funds come from, there's something called the National Transit Database that you can dig into. It's something that the Federal Transit Administration, uses to support funding and policy decisions and distribute funds. There's been a federal role in regional planning. I think the work that federal funds that flow into planning organizations and other decision making, I think, is really critical for informing how regions decide to allocate their funds. There's always more projects and more ideas than regional funding and funding that your transit agency has. So being able to kind of look at the data, look at the transit, look at travel demand, and where one might invest is it's really critical to have that based on good data and to know where the needs are.
Thanks. Rebecca, do you have any comments on data research needs? If you do, please feel free. Otherwise, it's okay.
Well, I'll just add, as a staff at a think tank, we rely tremendously on the federal data that often comes from local agencies, local transit agencies that submit data to the federal government. I think that there are actually a lot of private sources of data also, though, increasingly with telematics on vehicles and especially if and when we transition to autonomous vehicles, there's a lot of data being collected in the private sector in those for those fleets. And so I think that there are as sources of data for transportation planning and for, making operational decisions about origin and destinations of passengers. There's actually a lot of data outside of the federal government that's important to be able to access. And then, the federal government, we also provide funding to transportation planning agencies that they can use to collect local data on origin and destination and ridership needs. So that's an important role that the federal government plays in enabling local agencies to make their planning decisions.
Great, thanks. So here in the front row, Hannah, we have a question. Thanks.
Thank you. Jarrett, you talked about the decreasing revenue sources from the fare box, which has, of course, always been a minority of the funding for running your public transportation system. And I know that some cities or transit areas have experimented with fare-free transit. And I was wondering if you had any data or information on uh, driving up demand through making transit fare-free in certain areas.
Yeah, that question comes up a lot, and I think we went through this sort of very interesting experiment in the U.S., if you want to call it that, during the pandemic, where most transit systems in the U.S. actually went fare free. Now, obviously, the ridership patterns were very different. White collar workers pretty much dropped off entirely, but I mean, I think the stat was like during COVID, 40% of workers were not remote. And in transit in most cities, not necessarily here as much, but most cities, transit is very blue collar ridership, service worker ridership. So I think it's interesting to kind of look back on that and how that played out. I mean, it's a little bit hard to kind of separate the pandemic dynamics and what that meant for housing and employment and travel patterns. A number of other cities have tried this. I think a lot of college or smaller towns, smaller systems where often the cost of fare collection actually exceeds the fares collected. So some systems have made that determination in small cities not to do it. But I think for large systems, it's a trade off. If fare collection is part, even if it's 20 to 30% of the operating cost, if you're not collecting that, then and your budget stays the same, that your trade off is going to be less service, and that's a trade off. It may drive up your ridership, but it creates a revenue hole. So I think the challenge there for folks that are thinking about this is, is that trade off something we're willing to make, or are we willing to find additional funding? And that often means finding additional sources at the local, or sometimes state, but very much a local level on thinking about how to finance it. So I think something I think regions should consider if it's something they want to do. And some regions have done it, but understanding the trade-offs of what you lose and what you gain is really important.
Thanks. Rebecca, do you have any thoughts about the fare free?
Two quick thoughts. One thing is that some transit systems are probably primarily providing service to workers, residents of their city, and in which case there's probably better ways to encourage ridership than through transit benefits and other incentives that you could work through employers and encourage them to get their staff to use transit for their commutes. Other transit systems might be much more heavily used by tourists, a tourist economy. And in that case, it may make a difference to have transit be free. It can be a burden, a barrier to use if you're in a city you're not familiar with to figure out what's the fare system, how much do you pay, where do you pay, where do I get the card? Those are all small points of friction that prevent people from using transit. And so I think in that situation, maybe it does have more of an effect on ridership, but understanding kind of what kind of system that you are and therefore what would be the best specific strategy to increase ridership, I think is very useful.
Great, thanks. We're just about at time. Jarrett, if you have any final thought, I'm happy to give you another 30 seconds to a minute, and then Rebecca will do the same for you. If there's anything that you'd like to close with, please feel free.
I just want to thank folks for coming out today. I think it's a challenge. It's in some ways a challenging landscape for public transportation, just in the scope of where funding discussions are and where federal policy is. It's it's a space that's not just federal; it's also state, it's also local. These feed in together. But I think there's a lot of opportunities just given some of the discussions communities are having. There is a renewed interest, I think, in public transportation and the importance in revisiting some of the ideas we've had about development and how we operate transit. So, while there are some challenges ahead, I think still a lot of opportunities.
Great, thanks. And Rebecca, would you like the last word?
Sure. Never turn down the last word. I will. I'll just close with a personal story. I love transit. Really I think that it's just a critically important part of building a community, like meeting people that you don't know and just like being part of your city or town. And so much so that I actually took the bus on my wedding day with my husband to the church where we got married. We took the bus there, the S2, it was great. So anyway, love transit and please do everything you can to support it.
We got married in rural Vermont, which is where we're from. We did not have a bus for the wedding, but we did rent school buses for the reception, and they were apparently off the hook. People will still be like, remember that bus ride? I'm like, no, I don't remember the bus ride. It was a big deal. They were yellow and everything. It was super cool. Rebecca and Jarrett, thank you so much for joining us today. I think you deserve a nice round of applause for your great remarks. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who joined us in the room today. Thanks for everyone in our online audience. Big thanks to Senator Welch and his great staff for helping us with the room today. And thanks to Representative McIver and her great staff for helping her make her way to our room today, and so that to give her an opportunity to share some of her thoughts. Also like to say thanks to my colleagues, Dan O and Omri and Allison and Hannah and Anna and Nicole. They're kind of our usual suspects, but we also have Susan and Jeff with us today. So thank you very much for helping out. This is our first briefing of this time of year without our interns. And so you're kind of missing out because we had 3 really awesome spring interns, Hadley, Raneem, and Whitney. They're not with us. I think last week was their last week with us. And so anyway, good luck to them. Maybe someday they'll come back and be briefings panelists as well. Thanks to Gray and Troy for helping us get the word out to our online audience. Here's just a link to the survey again. If you have a few moments and you'd like to take the survey, we'd really appreciate that. If you're in our online audience and you had any issues with the AV quality or anything like that, please let us know. If you have ideas for future briefings, please let us know. We're also taking ideas for our rapid readouts briefing series too, and you can use this survey to communicate that with us as well. We have some briefings coming up next week, the 28th. This is Memorial Day weekend. Next week is the first official week of summer. We're going to be here talking about railroads, which will be super cool. And then on June 13th, we're going to be talking about highways. And then we have briefings coming up around extreme heat. We have the Congressional Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Expo and Policy Forum on July 24th. Lots of great stuff. We'll also be announcing more rapid readouts soon. If you haven't already subscribed to our biweekly newsletter, Climate Change Solutions, you can do that by visiting us online at eesi.org. Thanks to everyone. Sorry for going a few minutes over, but that's just kind of the EESI way. Thanks again to Rebecca and Jarrett for joining us today, and we'll see you next week, hopefully for railroads. Thank you.